In this video, you are going to learn pretty much everything you need to know about the rotator cuff, everything from its anatomy and biomechanics to training and training application, how to train each portion of the rotator cuff specifically, as well as myth busting. So without further ado, let's jump right into the anatomy section. So which are the muscles in the rotator cuff? Well, you have the supraspinatus, you have the infraspinatus, you have the teres minor, and you have the subscapularis. Don't worry about how complicated these names sound. We're going to go over each muscle and its relative function. Also, don't ask me why the rotator cuff is just these four muscles and doesn't include other muscles that attach directly to the shoulder blade, like the teres major, for example, or like the rear delts. But these are the four, so these are the four that we're going to talk about today. So starting with the supraspinatus, here's what it looks like. It's the one that is on the top side of the scapula. For any of you who are curious, the word supra basically means above and infra means below, and spine is really the root of this part of the word here. So this is the spine of the scapula, so supraspinatus above the spine, infraspinatus is down here, which we'll go over in a little bit. So this is the supraspinatus, this is where it attaches above the point on the upper arm. Now, for each of these muscles, what I'm gonna display here is basically what I would describe as a muscle's torque producing capability, which is kind of just a fancy way, a biomechanics way to say, hey, this is how the muscle rotates the joint when it contracts. And in order to figure out what a muscle's function is, that's what you have to look at, okay? So this is basically the joint center of the upper arm, that red dot right there. And if we draw some kind of line of force as represented by the blue arrow here, we can know, okay, this muscle pulls on top of that axis, that center point, that red point right there. And if it pulls on top of that axis and it pulls at some kind of distance, which is now represented by the green, what we know about that muscle is that it will create rotation in that direction outward. So this is known as AB or abduction, which is basically just the same as me saying I'm raising my arm out to the side. So the supraspinatus, along a few other things we'll discuss sort of holistically later when it comes to the entire rotator cuff, the supraspinatus pulls the arm out, kind of like your middle delt pulls the arm out. Okay, so I'm only going to explain that kind of thing once, the arrows and the dots. From here forward, you now know, okay, that red dot, whenever you see the red dot, that represents the axis of rotation or the joint center of the upper arm. That that blue arrow represents the line of pull or line of action of the muscle. And then the green represents basically the distance that blue arrow is pulling from that red joint center, which basically just tells us, okay, hey, in what direction and with what amount is that muscle pulling in that direction. So are these things necessary to understand super deeply? No, but in terms of understanding the baseline biomechanics, absolutely. And I think this is sufficient for most of us in terms of our understanding. It's certainly sufficient to understand muscle function. Okay, cool. So with that explanation out of the way, here is the infraspinatus. Also, as you're gonna see, we need to look at these muscles from different angles to really understand their function. So here's what I mean in relation to the infraspinatus. And by the way, hopefully you can see, supraspinatus again above, supra above, infra below. And here's that spine of the scapula, okay? So infraspinatus, huge muscle. It sits like basically under the rear delt. The rear delt kind of sits directly on top of it. So getting this muscle bigger can actually sort of bulk out the appearance of the rear delt in a kind of cool way. But anyway, if we look at this muscle's function in terms of its rotational ability, we need to look at it from below going upwards. Right? So from low to high here, I know it's a little bit disorienting, but basically just pretend that you're underneath someone's armpit and you're looking up at their armpit. That's how we're looking at this. So to understand the infraspinatus's function, here's that red dot, that joint center. Here's that blue line, that line of action. Here's that distance. We call that distance moment arm. It just basically represents, hey, this is what this muscle can do from a certain distance. What do all these things collectively create? They create external rotation. So external rotation, by the way, would be me having my upper arm here and rotating it out like this. A lot of people get this confused because they just are looking at motion of the forearm. The forearm is essentially irrelevant, but it's kind of a guide, right? Because none of this stuff down here is relevant to the shoulder. It's just a representation of what's happening. So you could have your elbow bent, you could have your elbow straight. This would be external rotation, internal rotation. This would be internal rotation, external rotation, okay? So when I talk about internal and external rotation, the joint actions I'm talking about are at the shoulder, not at the forearm, but the forearm is a good sort of guide to look at, and especially when we talk about exercise selection, that's gonna be relevant as well. And by the way, just as a kind of clear visual representation, internal rotation, i.e. this, would look like this. and external rotation, the opposite, would look like this. So you can kind of pick a point, like pick a point on the outside of the upper arm and be like, okay, is that point rotating toward the front side of the body? If so, internal rotation. Is that point rotating kind of more toward the back? That would be external rotation. You could do that in this kind of neutral arm at the side shoulder position, or if you raise your arm up to the side like this, then internal rotation would be, again, point a finger here, internal rotation this way, external rotation that way. Okay, so that's what it looks like from a bony perspective. And again, so internal, external, my arm's down here, internal, external. You could do that with an arm bent or straight. Again, from here below is not relevant. From here above, that's the joint space that we're looking at. Okay, cool. So supraspinatus, the one that sits above right here, right, pulls the arm out into abduction. Right, like just like the deltoid, it pulls the arm outward, and then the infraspinatus here pulls the arm into external rotation. Cool. When we think about the teres minor is just this little guy that kind of sits directly underneath of the infraspinatus. And in order to understand its function, we need to do basically the same thing, right? Look from low to high. Here's that joint center. Here's that action line. Here's that distance that indicates, hey, pulls the arm outward into external rotation, just like the infraspinatus. So this muscle right here, the supraspinatus, is the one that pulls the arm out. These two are going to rotate the arm externally. And then this last one we're going to look at in just a second. But before we do that, one other brief thing, and I'm not going to go super in depth into all this, but one other thing to understand is that these muscles also have other functions. We'll talk about that a little bit later and how they function collectively, because that's very important to understand. But if we just looked at the teres minor, you could also look at it from this perspective, and you could say, okay, there's the joint center, there's the action line, there's the distance. Well, this muscle could also function as the shoulder adductor, meaning it could literally pull the arm inward like this. So this muscle, the teres minor, could perform the opposite action as the supraspinatus that we were just looking at, which would pull the arm outward, okay? So I know there's a lot of jargon, a lot of language here, but ultimately teres minor has multiple functions. All these muscles technically have some degree of multiple functions, but we'll cover that in the training section in terms of how to make sure that you're training all their functions, okay? So then the last muscle, the subscapularis, this is the only one that sits on the front side, and it basically just looks like the scapula, and it covers the entire front border. It's actually a really big, thick, strong muscle. It's not like a little twinky muscle that many people probably think that it is. And in order to understand its primary function, again, same thing, look from low to high. We're looking up at an armpit. Here's that joint center. Here's that line of action. Here's that moment arm distance. Boom, internal rotation, right? So again, unlike the ones in the back, which externally rotate, this one on the front internally rotates, okay? So super important to understand that. Just simplify it in your head. Ready? Ready? I'm going to really simplify it. The rotator cuff muscles that sit above, pull the arm above. The ones that sit below, pull the arm below. The ones that sit on the back, pull the arm back into external rotation. And then the one that sits on the front, pulls the arm into internal rotation. So if you can watch and rewind the last 15 seconds of what I just said, you will understand every kind of function. You don't even need to know the muscle names, okay? Just as long as you understand the location and the lines of action, good to go. So again, supraspinatus, the one on the top, infraspinatus, the one below, teres minor, the baby infraspinatus, I think of it as, and then the subscapularis. These are the four. Now, when we think about how all of them function collectively, they basically, and I think this is pretty cool, they basically just look like your shoulder blade. Like if you took these images and you just remove the shoulder blade entirely from the image, it would kind of look like the muscles of the rotator cuff are just forming a shoulder blade, and that's what they do. They hug around the shoulder blade and they hug the upper arm. And this really gets us into the next section here, which is myths around these muscles. And when we talk about their function overall, which we'll talk about in myth number 2, you'll kind of see how I think a lot of this stuff kind of neatly ties together. Okay, so first of all, just to get the first myth out of the way, I think this is still unfortunately something a lot of people believe. People think the rotator cuff is special. They think it's a special little snowflake that can't handle load, that can't handle tension, that can't handle resistance, that doesn't adapt the same way that our muscles do, that doesn't adapt the same way that other big groups do. This is not true. There's no evidence to suggest that this is the case. Are they on average smaller muscles compared to like the delts and the pecs and the lats? Yes. So that means that we can't use as much weight when we're training them, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't train them hard. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't train them in terms of the principle principles in exactly the same way that we train other muscles. So get this thing out of your head that says that the rotator cuff is some kind of special snowflake. Don't treat them differently, right? They are just a muscle. They adapt like every other one. There's nothing unique about them in that sense. People will say things like, it needs light loads. And yeah, in a relative sense, like, are you going to use the same amount of load that you would use on a pull down? No, obviously not. But in the sense that, like, people are suggesting you need to do like 30 rep sets, or you need to do sets that are 50 reps away from failure. No, it doesn't need that. It doesn't, again, no special snowflake muscles here. You don't need to do specific exercises. There are no bulletproofing exercises for this muscle group. Get that idea out of your head. So when you see stuff like this, or like this, or like this, can these kinds of techniques be valuable? Yes, in terms of directly loading the cuff, they can be. But are you really going to stick to this green 5-pound resistance band for the entirety of your rotator cuff career? No, I think not. I would hope not, if you actually want to train that group and get that group actually robust and actually resilient. That's not what we're in the gym to do. So factual correction, your rotator cuff muscles are just like every other, as I mentioned. So train them hard if you want them strong, okay? There's nothing complicated about it. Now, myth number 2. This is gonna kind of maybe muddy the water just for a second, but this idea that you must do rotator cuff drills if you want healthy shoulders. Absolutely not true. You absolutely do not need any of the specific options that we're about to go over in this training section. But if you want to train the rotator cuff specifically, which we'll go over reasons why you would want to do that, then absolutely use specific exercises. If you want a specific muscle to get bigger and stronger, do a specific exercise for them. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. However, when we think about the overall function collectively, this is what I was alluding to earlier of the rotator cuff is getting trained all the time. All the time. With any shoulder exercise, literally any shoulder exercise. Literally, right now your rotator cuff is working to just center your upper arm in its socket. So let's look at the function again. So remember how I mentioned that the rotator cuff is essentially just like a mimic, it's like a mirror image of this shoulder blade, and the rotator cuff just holds, they're basically these hands that hold the shoulder blade and the upper arm together like this, okay? And the way that they're able to do that as a collective group, this is, I guess, part of the reason why they're a group, like a cuff group, is the fact that when you look at something like the subscapularis, so left side of the screen, remember it's the one on the front, it pulls the arm into that internally rotated position. But if you think about what the function of something like the infraspinatus or the teres minor is, it pulls the arm in the opposite direction, okay? And what happens when both of these muscles contract simultaneously? Well, you have the ones on the back that pull like that, you have the ones on the front that pull like that, and as a consequence of both of these things contracting simultaneously, we form what is called a kind of vector sum, and both of those things basically lead to this red arrow right there. And what that red arrow indicates is that these muscles collectively take this upper arm and they go, whack, right? Whack. They smush the upper arm into the shoulder socket. Why? So that the arm doesn't fall out of the shoulder socket, okay? It makes sense when you think about it that simply. This cuff group is basically just this group of happy friends who are all collectively holding this upper arm into the socket. And so what that means is that any time that you go to do any exercise, it's a lateral raise, it's a chest press, it's an overhead press, it's a wide row, it's a narrow row, it's a pull down, it's a pullover, it's any kind of shoulder motion. It's even any kind of upper arm motion where you're doing like a curl, a biceps exercise, a triceps exercise, an overhead triceps extension. Doesn't matter. Anytime there is force imposed on the shoulder, these guys collectively are active, of course, to varying degrees depending on the motion, in holding the shoulder together, okay? So if there's any humongous takeaway from this video, it is that, and it is that the specific exercises we're going to go over are great for specific applications, but they are by no means necessary. I have not personally done rotator cuff training, like I'm isolating this muscle for this specific purpose in a very long time, just because I don't have a reason to, because it's getting trained all the time, okay? So when we talk about training, before we do, I just wanna make a few cases, because it kind of might seem like, oh, I'm anti-rotator cuff training. I'm absolutely not. It might seem like I'm that, but there are certain cases where it really makes sense. So do you need to? I mean, do you need to train any muscle? That's kind of a stupid question, but let's get more specific about when you might want to. So number one, pain, injury, or rehab. So if you're someone who has some kind of rotator cuff tear, you're coming back from a surgery, right? You have some kind of pain, that rotator cuff exercises appear to help. These are all specific cases in which it might be sensible for you to include rotator cuff training. Sorry, there was a dog barking in the background. I don't know if you can hear it. I hope you can't. But anyway, these kinds of situations are the most obvious to me. Like, oh, you literally had rotator cuff surgery X number of months ago. We need to get that group specifically stronger. Cool. If you find that it helps, with certain kinds of mobility goals, like if you are training, so let's say for a sport or a specific activity that is like, okay, for whatever reason, I need to get my arms into this position and I can't really do that comfortably, or when I get there, it's a little bit, feels a little bit clunky, right? And I want to be stronger in that position. For instance, if you're someone who engages in like physical sport, like jujitsu or Muay Thai or whatever it happens to be, having increased amounts of contractile ability in those muscles can really help in those instances, right? Because there are certain positions in certain sports wherein creating rotation of the upper arm is very important. A great, super common example would be like baseball, like throwing a freaking baseball is super important. Like it's literally, a lot of it comes from internal rotation of the upper arm. There are many instances in which, my point being here, that it would be sensible that you would want to train the rotator cuff. And then the last is just enjoyment, like anything else. If you like to do it and it makes your shoulders feel great, fucking do it. Like, who am I to say, who is anyone really to suggest that you shouldn't do something in the gym that you like to do, and then that motivates you to go to the gym. Okay, so when we talk about big picture principles from a training perspective, there are really two that come to mind. Number one, use an arm support. Now, I put a red X on this photo. Does that mean that this exercise is all of a sudden garbage? No, but again, if you want to take training the rotator cuff super seriously, this is not something that I would recommend. We're going to go over multiple examples here in just a second, but make sure you are bracing this bone. You do not want this bone having to float around in free space as you're trying to move your upper arm in rotation. That would kind of be like saying, oh, it doesn't matter, if you use a thigh pad during a leg curl or during a seated leg curl or not, just control it with your hip, right? That wouldn't make sense. That wouldn't be very specific to the goal. So use an arm support, number one. Number two, train different shoulder angles. So we went over the different kinds of rotation, how you can be in sort of this more neutral position here, and you can train rotation this way, but you can also put your arm up here and train rotation this way. And training rotation this way will train slightly different angles of these fibers on the back and the front, which I think is just important, again, if your overall goals are to make your shoulder rotators as robust as possible. So from sort of most complicated to least complicated here, we're gonna go over different setups. This is like, if you're like the most serious, like, man, I just want every little possible ounce of stimulus going to my external rotators possible, we'll start with the external rotation stuff, and then we'll go over to the internal rotation stuff. This is like an option that would be that kind of thing, right? I got the cuff on my wrist, I got the brace from a bench that I literally dragged over to this cable column, I got the opposite hand brace here, and all I'm doing is I'm training external rotations, right? So arm is kind of at the side, and arm is smushed into that bench. So what you'll see here in just a second is a kind of arrow that is going to indicate exactly how I'm imagining shoving. I'm just creating this rotation of my upper arm as I am keeping my arm glued to the bench. And I'm setting the cable roughly parallel to my forearm there, so you basically can't see it from that angle. So this is like the most like stacked up version of an external rotation possible. Could you do this same thing without a bench? You could, but then you're gonna have to be managing sort of where your arm is flopping. So an alternative to this strategy could be like you could put a towel somewhere here. You see that commonly in rehab settings, something thick basically just between your torso and your arm to stabilize your body. That would be a fine option. Now another option to sort of make a point about, again, see this upper arm position, I'm a bit wider now. You could just basically jam your upper arm into a cable column. This one is super, super accessible. You don't need any additional setup really. So use a wider arm angle and just perform external rotations in this position. This one personally is a favorite of mine just for convenience sake. If someone is going to want to train external rotation, especially in bodybuilding, right? This kind of upper arm position where the arm, this kind of position where the upper arm is all the way out here, bodybuilding, right? sort of tasks you to get back here. So people who maybe want to improve their posing, I've had them do drills where their arm is out here, where they're really trying to get back so that they can boom, show off that back double bicep or whatever the hell it's called. So again, overall, just have your arm sort of jammed up against something. You're getting pulled into internal rotation, against which you are externally rotating. Now, if we look at some dumbbell options, I'll just let both of these play simultaneously. You see a very similar theme, right? You could do it with 2 arms, you could do it with 1 arm, you could do it with your arm kind of in front of you doing that thing, you could do it with your arms behind you. Regardless, just training, you know, finding a couple variations, maybe one that's more like with your arm at your side and one that's, you know, more with your arm up here or up here. Both of these are going to be great options as well. I figured I would show dumbbell selections just to show how you would want to do that. Many of you are probably at least familiar with these kinds of things in principle. The one thing you do have to remember with dumbbells as compared to cables is that if I move the dumbbell too far toward this other side of the bench, it's just gonna flop the other way, right? So if I have a dumbbell here and I put it to this side of my arm, it's gonna pull my arm in this opposite direction, which, hey, maybe a cool application for that, I don't know. But when you're thinking about just training external rotation, you don't wanna go past that point because then you'll be training all kinds of different things. You'll be training both directions basically, and the dumbbell will be falling in the opposite direction. So these are 2 great options. Now, if we go over to the internal rotation stuff, I got 2 options here. Let's pause this one on the right just to look at the one on the left. It's exactly the same as the one that we looked at for external rotation, but now instead of the cable being all the way down, it's all the way up, so that's pulling me into external rotation, against which I'm internally rotating. Again, this is a wider arm position 1, which I would recommend as just one option if you're super serious about getting internal rotation strong to the point of pitching. This could be great for someone who's trying to strengthen the ability for them to sort of maybe throw a baseball, get those muscles stronger in that position. And again, principally, upper arm is braced. You know, not much more to it than that. It's pretty simple. Now this one is a bit unusual. This is kind of like the inverse of the bench one that I started with, where instead of having something on the outside of my upper arm, just because at this particular time of filming it was a pain in the ass, I just thought, hey, why not just hold my upper arm with my other arm? And you know, to be honest, it felt pretty good. It's something that could be really quick and easy that you could do for external rotation, right? So imagine if the cable were anchored in the opposite direction, so we're going this way, just like the one that we started with. You could just take your opposite hand, boom, jam it up against, you know, your working side biceps and do the external rotations that way. Not a bad sort of application there. Of course, you could find a bench, something external to you to jam your arm up against. That would be perfectly acceptable as well. But this is just one option, again, like this other one to, you know, choose from. Again, hopefully the principles are clear. In all these cases, by the way, I know I've mentioned it briefly, you just want to make sure that this cable right here is parallel roughly to the forearm. So you see that my forearm kind of moving in this direction. You want the cable basically roughly just in line with wherever your forearm is moving. That's a good rule of thumb. Okay, and then some dumbbell options. These ones look a little bit sillier, but you know, they're just loading internal rotation in different positions. Your arms could be at your sides like this, pulling outward. Your arms could be up here, pulling backward. Both of these principally are the same as the ones that we just looked at, right? But now they're happening, or I'm doing them with dumbbells. So regardless of where you look, it's basically the same. Stabilize this freaking bone, just create the rotation with whatever load direction is appropriate to the one that you're trying to actually train. If you're trying to train internal rotation, you need a load pulling you into external rotation. If you're trying to train external rotation, you need a load pulling you into internal rotation. Once you've got the upper arm brace, the correct loading direction parallel to the forearm, then guess what? These are all variations that I showed that are fantastic, that you can load and progress and get those muscles stronger and get those muscles bigger. You don't have to treat these muscles like special snowflakes because ultimately they're not. You just have to choose the right amount of load for your current abilities right now. If in the past you've had trouble loading these motions without pain, start a little bit lighter, build up the tolerance more slowly, start with a slower or a lower amount of volume. And if you're really serious about training the cuff, you know, I would maybe start with one of each of these variations that you saw here and progress that for a while. And then eventually, if you want to add another variation, you can choose a different upper arm position and you can add that into your arsenal as well, or you could just swap it out for the ones that you started with if eventually those stall or you just get bored of them. So overall, from anatomy to training, I hope that this breakdown was helpful for you. If you want to learn more from me, please check the links in the description. I have a ton of biomechanics content, everything from beginner courses to advanced courses to exercise libraries to things that make targeting any muscle super simple to a personal trainer course. Whatever it happens to be related to biomechanics, it's there, and you can learn from it. And if you think a friend would like this video, please share it with them, and I'll see you all in the next one.